I am Ilkka Sovanto from the Finnish National Cybersecurity Center, and I'm very honored to be invited here and speak to you today. So, what I'm going to be talking about is Heartbleed and what's our role with the Finnish Cybersecurity Center with dealing with this was. So, one of the many things that we do there includes vulnerability coordination. So from time to time we get reports from researchers, security companies, or individual people who have found some issue in some product, and then we help them coordinate the issue and find the right way to contact the developer and organize the response in a proper way. Okay, so let's get started. So the issue was affecting Openssl, which is one of the most popular implementations for TLS SSL encryption. And TLS is supposed to provide a secure way of communication between a server and a client. So the vulnerability in this case affected the most recent version of Openssl, which is the 101 version, which was released in the spring of 2012. And the vulnerability was in the Heartbleed extension that was implemented for that version for TLS. And what Heartbleed is, it's basically like ping, which you all know, where the other end sends a packet to the other end with some data, and then the server will reply with the same amount of data. And in this case, the server didn't actually check what was the claimed amount of data that the client sent. So in this case, the server would then reply with the amount of data that was requested, and because it was not in the original request, then it would have to take some arbitrary amount of data from the memory and return it to the client. So, I'll be talking about what's happened behind the scenes on the Finnish side when some researchers from the Finnish security company Cloudflare first discovered the issue, and we started analyzing it. So it was first found out on Thursday, April the 3rd, earlier this year. And Riku from Cloudflare was testing a new feature they had implemented in their products, which would check for strange replies from the system that is being tested. And one of the standard ways they do when they're implementing or testing new products is that they often take a open source implementation of some software and try their fuzzing tools against those. So those are kind of like their standard test equipment. So they found this in the morning, and later that afternoon me and my colleague Jussi were notified about this. And actually, as a matter of coincidence, we happened to be on a memory forensics course where we were studying what you could find out from a memory dump from computers, and this actually turned out to be somewhat relevant because we have this bug that actually leaks random bits of memory, and we are just studying about different ways to try to understand what is actually contained within that memory. Here in the bottom you can see a piece of the chat that we used to talk with the researchers who had found this. And this is a very useful way. It's a secure and quick, easy way to chat. And as you can see, it is encrypted in Finnish. On the other hand, also Openssl is being used to encrypt the traffic, so maybe in this case that wasn't the perfect means. Okay, so to further decrypt the chat there, it went something like this. So, what did you find, asks Jussi. Well, Openssl is leaking memory about 55 kilobytes chunks for each request. And it could be that there is some keying material also being leaked. And to make things worse, there is absolutely no kind of authentication required to exploit this bug. And it doesn't only affect the server when being attacked from the client, but it also works the other way around. So if a client connects to a malicious server, the server can also send this same request, and then the client will instead leak the memory. And at this point, they had already seen some pieces of the public certificate that's being used to authenticate that connection. Okay. Jussi is like, what? What are you talking about? Can that really be? Sounds very odd. Okay. We went to the source repository for the Openssl project, and we were able to quite quickly locate the place, the offending code that was actually causing the bug. And looking at the history, we saw that the commit had actually been made to the version control just before the New Year's Eve at the very end of 2011. So later that night, after the course, me and Jussi went back to the hotel room and started to look more closely at what it was that Codenomicon had found. At first, we had to wait for a while for Codenomicon to deliver us the tool which we could use to reproduce the issue so we could try it out for ourselves. So waiting for that, we decided to start looking where the code was being used, so what type of product services would be affected by this. So the first thing was to check the open source Linux and other open source distributions, and it turns out all of the latest releases of the major distributions had the latest version, which made them all vulnerable. We also checked some previous versions of Openssl in case anyone had decided to backport this vulnerable functionality to those earlier versions. Well, luckily not. Then we looked at some network equipment and embedded devices if they would be using the vulnerable version of the library. A good thing in this case would be SCADA products which are notorious for running old software and never getting patches. In this case, this might actually turn out a good thing for them, because many of them would not be running the latest version of Openssl, but some earlier release which would not include the vulnerable code. Looking back, this is a part of the advisory that we put out on our website, and the list of products that were affected was kind of extensive. Well, this is not all of it, the list goes on. And there's lots of things there, and only these that are here cover a fairly big part of the internet. Some interesting thing we noticed was SSL VPN. Okay, there's SSL, so it might be affected by this, and VPN, which is usually kind of a sensitive thing. Well, this wouldn't be a problem if the best practices are followed, and if you're using two-factor authentication. So hopefully most people are using that, but what might happen if they didn't? So in this case, this was a news article from later that year. The Community Health Service in the US was actually affected by this when someone had connected to their SSL VPN server exploited the bug, leaked some memory, which did happen to contain the credentials of some user connecting to that VPN endpoint. And then they used these credentials to connect themselves there, and then within the internal network further compromise their system. Okay, we quite soon got the tool so we could try it out ourselves, and then we started to analyze in more detail what the bug would actually mean, to try to find out as much as we can within a short period of time about the bug. So around 9 p.m. We started getting the dumps of memory that were leaking from vulnerable services. We set up a test server which we would connect to and then download pieces of memory from there. And then we would look at that and trying to see what kind of things we can find there. At first, it did take us some time to try to actually get a good look at the actual data, because the attack was made over an encrypted tunnel, and as some of you may have some experience working with Wireshark and trying to decrypt the traffic isn't always going like in the movies. So I decided to have a closer look at the Openssl memory layout by taking a memory dump of the whole server process from the server side, and Jussi worked on improving the tool to reproduce the issue. Sometime before midnight, we had already found a lot of very interesting things there, like HTTP basic authentication credentials, which we had sent there previously, and then we were able to get them back after with a later session that we took there. A bunch of other rather interesting looking data was also sitting there. I also decided to have a look at the private key issue, if I could actually get the server to leak its private RSA key, which is in the very core of protecting the secure connection. About 2:45 a.m. During that same night, I had for the first time extracted critical components of the private key from the test server. And at that point, we decided to call it a day. The XKCD comic had a very nice strip about this issue, and here at the top we can also see some frustration that we shared and some humor which we had to try to help ourselves deal with this better. So here at the top, Jussi is saying that NSA is probably having a bunch of face palms if they didn't have this chance to send out some heartbeats to here and there. And here Marko is saying that, okay, thanks, that makes me feel much better. Okay, so some implications from the data points that we had found out at that point. So first of all, exploiting the bug leaves no traces, no logs whatsoever on the server when it's exploited. Secondly, if you do this after having all the proper SSL handshakes, you're actually doing this over the encrypted tunnel, which means that all the data that is being returned is also actually encrypted. So looking at that from the network side, you cannot really tell what has been leaked. So this would mean basically any information that sits in the memory of a service that is affected could leak. And these are the things that we actually saw that had been leaking. So basically any personal information, any sensitive information that's there, user credentials that could be used on different systems, because many people like to reuse the same passwords across different systems. If an admin user also uses this to log on to a system, this could be used to steal those and then use those credentials to compromise the system further. And if an attacker manages to get hold of these private keys, not only could they perform a man-in-the-middle attack to impersonate the service, but they could also take that key and decrypt any connections that they might have recorded in the past. And here I was thinking, oh wait, wasn't I reading a couple of months earlier in the news about NSA or some other big intelligence agencies just storing massive amounts of encrypted communications in a big database, just in case in some later point of time they come up with some way to attack the encryption. There might be something here. If the server was actually using perfect forward secrecy, then it would be using a different key for each session, and you could not go back and use this key to decrypt those previous sessions. On the other hand, on the memory forensics course, we were studying about TrueCrypt and how you could extract the key used by TrueCrypt from memory. And I learned about this very nifty tool called AES Key Find, which looks at the memory and can point out that, okay, here is an AES key being actively used. So I took this tool and ran it on a couple of memory dumps from a vulnerable service, and lo and behold, I did see a bunch of AES keys there. So what would those be? Well, those would be the temporary session keys used by SSL to encrypt the traffic. So even if you didn't have a private key, you could use those keys to decrypt the sessions that were taking place if you had a privileged position which allows you to observe the traffic going in the network. So the recommendations would be that certificates would need to be changed in case the private key has been stolen. There's a very good chance that anyone using this would be able to get pretty much any password that's being used on a vulnerable service. Possibly even some session cookies that might be leaked perhaps should be invalidated. So these are the open questions we had in this point still very early on with the analysis. So could we actually reproduce the private key leak on an actual production system? How widespread is actually the use of the vulnerable OpenSSL library? What are the closed source products that use it? It is a very popular library, and many companies like to take something which they can take for free and incorporate it. How would we go about contacting all these vendors that are using it? Are there any critical systems that are also using OpenSSL? How will we go about mitigations? Is there any way to make a workaround to prevent the exploitation of this bug? How hard would it be to create a patch to actually fix this issue? A very interesting question we had quite early: does someone already know about this? Is there a way we can try to find out? Finally, if everyone will have to change their certificates, what will happen, for example, revocation lists blowing very big? So, further trying to assess the possible impact from this, Codenomicon created a simple proof of client tool which would allow us to even more easily reproduce the issue and would help with the analysis. We created a simple Python-based proof of concept also. Then I tried this against a number of different open source software like Nginx, Apache, Exim, and a number of other pieces of software. And in pretty much all cases, after some time, I was able to get the private key from each of them. We and Codenomicon both tested this against some of our own production systems, and all of them returned a bunch of data very nicely. Very carefully, we also did some spot checks on some services over the internet to see if they support this functionality, which would most likely contain the vulnerability. So things really didn't look very good at this point. About mitigations, the easiest way we came up with would be to disable the Heartbleed feature completely from the library. But there isn't a configuration file which you could use to do this, but you actually have to recompile the whole library and then install the new version. So we created some packages that were compiled like this and deployed them on our own services, because we would quite likely be the first ones that would be attacked when this eventually would come out. To create a patch, well, looking at the Openssl code isn't really that fun, so we would much rather keep our sanity and let someone else do that. Here on the right, Marko and Jussi are talking about this again, and for example, there's a variable called pkey, which seems to, on some instances, refer to the private key, and at others, refer to the public key. So that's one demonstration that's not that nice to look at. Monitoring in case someone was already exploiting this in the wild. So we deployed some honeypots which would be able to detect attempts to exploit this vulnerability, and we deployed this on an existing honeynet which had about 2,000 to 300 IPs, mostly in Finland. We also made some initial snort rules which also detect them, and we deployed them in the sensor network called Havaro, which we run. Okay, so now having kind of a good understanding of the bug itself, what it would mean, and what would people need to do to respond to this, we started thinking about coordination and how would we go about notifying as many people as can so that they could prepare, and also preparing for the final release when it's all public, and then have good materials. So this is a rough outline of the plan that we had for this coordination effort. So first of all, we would need to have good materials which would explain this bug. So those who haven't heard of this before, what it would mean, what do they need to do, what do they need to consider when they are looking at their own products and services, how to respond. Well, of course you need a CVE number, so we decided to get one. We would make an initial version of a list of all the vendors that we would contact. We would contact the Openssl team, explain the issue to them, and negotiate a way to proceed. We would also contact Vultures, which is a collaboration between us and a few other bigger certs who are also in the business of vulnerability coordination on a global scale. So we would ask for help from them when we would start contacting all the different vendors, because the list would be quite long. And a few days before the vulnerability would be made public, we would contact the open source distributions who would need the least amount of time to roll out their patches and release it to everyone to download and install in their systems. Finally, we would have a coordinated publication. Openssl would put out their patches, advisories. We would have our advisories, and a number of vendors would have new software updates available, which end users and system administrators could just take and install. And then a global patching week would begin. Codenomicon had the idea that, okay, this is something really big, and it would be very convenient if people had some way to easily refer to this issue. So they came up with the idea that we should have some sort of a name and possibly even a logo. This logo was actually made on the next Monday, where their graphical designer spent about 20 minutes when she was given the name Heartbleed, which Ossi from Codenomicon had came up with on Saturday that weekend. For the final publication, we would collect questions and answers type of information that would answer the most typical questions from system administrators and also the media and the public, because it would quite probably be a rather big thing. Codenomicon also registered this domain where all the information would be for everyone to see very easily. How many of you did actually visit this site when it first came out and found it useful? Yeah, quite a few. So I think this was useful. So the correct information would be out as quickly as possible and distributed effectively. Okay, so now it is the next Monday, and we start with the first steps of coordination. So first, this is also the first day back at the office for me and Jussi. So first we would let our bosses know that there's something rather big going on, and can we please get some more people to help us. We drafted the first list of critical Finnish services that would be notified at some good points. We also, on Monday, we'll also ask for a CVE from CERT without going very much into the details. We and Codenomicon had handled together a number of different issues, also with Openssl, and actually the previous case where we had been in contact with Openssl was actually that same afternoon, so only a couple of hours earlier when we actually sent out the report on this issue to Openssl. Okay, and then we find out about something that makes things not go exactly to plan. So later it turned out that Google and Neil Meetha had actually already discovered this issue previously, and they had contacted Openssl project at the beginning of April. There had also been some coordination with some big players like Cloudflare and some others, so they could be protected from the issue before it was actually published. It also seems that the Openssl people had already some suspicions of details of this bug being leaked to some third parties. So when they around 6 p.m. that night got the report from us, they thought that the risk that there were even more people who know about this was too big, and they decided they should not wait any longer and just publish it all. So around 9 p.m. They published the patches and also a small announcement that the patches are now out. We didn't get any notification from Openssl directly, but Marko from Codenomicon noticed this, and then he called us. So, is it really possible that two different instances discovered this independently of each other and within a relatively short time frame. Well, actually, it is not even that rare. And perhaps one of the reasons that drove the different researchers towards the same end could have been some of the previous bugs that were earlier that fall. For example, the Apple Go to Fail and the GNU TLS problems, which had quite a severe impact also on SSL connections. But even though those really weren't quite as severe as this one. Okay, so now it's out. After a short discussion and deliberation, we decided that we should publish all the materials we had collected, which we first planned to use to notify the vendors that would be included in the coordination. So all that information would go out in the public, so we would not try to downplay the issue at all, but to allow people to realize very quickly how serious this issue really is. And our honeypots at that point had not received any attacks except that the testing ones that we did ourselves against them. About an hour and a half later, after the publication, we got the first hits. It was kind of fun to watch how the attacks actually looked like, how they were slowly getting more and more sophisticated. At first, they weren't really that sophisticated. The next morning, we put out our own warning and advisory, first in Finnish and later also in English. And a lot of briefing internally and within the Finnish government, and also the critical infrastructure players in Finland need to be briefed quite a bit. We had prepared some scanners for this vulnerability which we could use to scan the IP space to locate the services that were vulnerable, but at this point they were still in a fairly early state. But we did some first scans of some Finnish critical systems that we would notify immediately that you really need to patch this now. Later that same Tuesday, we scanned the entire Finnish IP space and reported all the findings to the system owners or through the ISPs. And many people found this very helpful because they just read on the news that there's something very big going on, and then they check their emails, which says that you have this, and these systems that are affected, and you should fix these first. And many of them were like, oh, I didn't actually realize we even had this system here. We did spend some effort improving the scanner at first. There were some bugs that didn't always detect the vulnerability very reliably, but we made some improvements there. We also made a virtual machine which we gave to the government so they could scan their internal networks with that. Here are some statistics of the results of the scans, which show quite nicely how the patching effort is progressing over the first few days. Then there was the question of private keys, if they do actually leak or not, even though our advisory and the information on the heartbleed.com webpage tried to state as clearly as possible that yes, this is not only a theoretical risk, but something that we have actually witnessed. So with that in mind, I was a bit surprised to see some comments like this from Google, which indicated that they had looked at this and thought that it would be quite unlikely that a private key would actually leak. So I was a bit puzzled by all this. The discussion went on. There were some blog posts, some of which said that, okay, we have analyzed this in detail. we could not reproduce the issue, and we are pretty sure that this either cannot happen or is very, very unlikely. And again, I was thinking, okay, with all the test scenarios that I had, with all the different software, I had succeeded pretty much every time. So I found this rather strange. Cloudflare, which was one of the institutions that had been blogging quite a bit about this, later that week had the very clever idea of setting up a challenge where anyone could attack this server that they had set up to see if they could try and extract the key from the server. So I thought that, okay, this would be a very good way to demonstrate the issue without actually giving any tools to script kiddies who would take that and go running around the internet and randomly attacking all the servers. So I had the tools already, and I thought I read their posts, and I was also a bit intrigued if they actually could have some sort of setup in which the private keys would actually not leak. So I decided to go and try to attack this server. So Friday night, I went home, set my tools towards the server, and left them running while preparing food and watching some TV. Every now and then, I came back to see if I had caught anything. I had this Python script here in the bottom that would just go over the memory dump and look for a prime number that would divide the public key of the certificate. And if it did, then that would be the critical part that I could use to reconstruct the private key. And eventually, just before I decided to go to bed, I checked for the last time, and it was there. So, what's happened with the project afterwards? Openssl got a lot of attention, which they really deserved, and there was many improvements with the project. They got some new funding, a couple of full-time employees to work on the project, and there was also a couple of forks that took the code base and tried to remove all the functionality that wasn't really needed. Finally, there are a number of devices, quite likely still out there, servers that maybe aren't really looked after that well, that may actually never be patched, or devices that might actually never even get the patches made available. And this is especially a problem for many embedded devices. I'll just have a few very quick words about Shellshocked and mainly the coordination there. So a kind of similar thing happened here, that yes, there was some coordination and a disclosure that could be called responsible, but on the other hand, again, when the disclosure happened and the coordination related, it only took into account the open source side of things. And again, many of the closed source vendors who include this in their products didn't really have a good chance to react and to deploy their own patches and firmware updates to fix the problem. I think I will skip this and leave some time for questions. Or how much time do we have? Okay,
minutes,
well,
yeah.
Let's go with questions.
My question is, you said that you identified the subversion commit that introduced that error. You said
you located the commit in Subversion that introduced that error. What do we know about the person who did it, and where does he work? Who does he work for? And what are the chances that that was intentional?
It was a German guy. Of course, there was a bit of speculation on just that issue. Personally, with really not much evidence, I don't think it was intentional. Bugs do appear.
Yeah, I think the interesting parts, and not just with this, with Heartbleed, but with a lot of other areas like Wi-Fi devices and so on, you said the point about how many embedded devices would not be there. So what could we do or encourage to actually get these up to date? Big question, but...
Embedded devices. One suggestion that I heard that I actually kind of like is kind of like an expiry date for these devices. So they would have some sort of a natural death, which would then force these devices to be replaced at least at some point in the future. So maybe that's one way to do it.
Any other questions? So I have one for you as well. Do you think that you have actually that you have started a new trend, and from now on all the big bugs are going to have logos and cool names?
Well, so far we have seen some in September, and recently we had some rather big bugs that also got good names and some logos. So we will see, maybe.
So do you think it helped in the way the problem was communicated and in solving the problem, the name and the logo?
I think there definitely is some value there, but also a risk of inflation. That's everyone who finds a bug that's, oh, this is really important, that I need to get some cool logo and name for this then. And that might somehow skew the actual impacts of the bug.
Okay, thank you very much for a very interesting presentation. Here's a small gift.
Thank you. And feel free to come by. I'd love to chat more about all this. I have some more stories and lots of interesting details. I'd love to go into details, but I didn't quite have the time here. So please come talk to me afterwards. Thanks.
Thanks.